You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, my name is Teodros Avery. I'm the professor of jazz studies here at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. And today is the 13th session of the class entitled Key Movements, the Age of Jazz. Today, I'll be talking about jazz and visual media. We'll examine how cartoons and film begin to fuse with the changes in women and in social values, and how these cartoons were used to promote jazz musicians such as Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway. We're going to start with a man by the name of Max Fleischer. You've seen his work, even if you don't know his name. Pretty much all of animation was created by this man. Max Fleischer was born on July 18th, 1883 in Krakow, Austro-Hungarian Empire. The son of Jewish parents, his mother and father immigrated to New York City when Max was only a young boy. A fascination for both cartoon, drawing, and technology led him into a career in animation. He eventually became a director and an inventor of about 30 different patents for animation production. He is best known for creating animated cartoon productions featuring popular characters including Betty Boop, Popeye the Sailor Man, and Superman. And I'll tell you how he eventually came to this point of creating the technology behind animation. His boss at the time, he had a job, he was a cartoonist and he had a job, and his boss came in and said he saw some production at a theater, a film. And he said it was so bad. He said it was horrible. And then he told Max that he should go into that area because what he saw was so bad and he felt that Max could actually improve it. Now, you see right here, this is a machine called a rotoscope, So this is the main invention that he created that allows animation allowed the technology to foster animation. Okay, now back during this time, what they would do was they would film a film with people, right? Regular people walking around, dancing, doing whatever. And then they would go and they would trace by hand on each frame. So if you saw a frame of a real human being, they would go in and they would trace a character like Popeye or like Betty Boop over that frame. So what you would get was the movement, the agility of a human being, but with a character that was a cartoon.
So that's what made that special. And that machine that he was using, the rotoscope, is what allowed him. Here's another picture of the rotoscope. That's what allowed them to draw over characters that move very fast. And then you had that
Quick, fast-looking cartoon, and you can, that would move around like a human being. Now you got to imagine that this is in the 1920s, 1930s. So for people that saw this technology, they were really, really impressed by it. I mean, you have to imagine at the time they would see, maybe a film of somebody, on the film dancing or doing some kind of routine or something like that, and often without sound. So now you can see visually, you can see a cartoon character that was created. You could see the creativity in that it was not a human being. It had moved on beyond a human being, and now you're seeing a character, but yet the character is moving quickly like a human being. So that really, really piqued people's interest during that time. And a lot of adults were also interested in watching cartoons. It's not like today where we kind of associate most cartoons with kids. During that time, a lot of adults watched cartoons as well because it was so different. And in a lot of ways, it was kind of like how we view CGI technology or any kind of like sci-fi technology, how it's way beyond what we would actually imagine in terms of real life, how we see things. For them, it was that. It was a real deviation away from regular life. Now we're going to watch a short documentary. We're going to learn about the rotoscope technology, and it's just going to give you some information about the technology
And how it was developed. So let's check this out.
Max Fleischer is responsible for some of the most beloved cartoon characters in history. Popeye the Sailor Man, Betty Boop, Superman. But Fleischer's first cartoon in 1919, Out of the Inkwell, may well have had the biggest impact of all. Not only did it introduce the character of Coco the Clown, it introduced an invention that would change animation forever, the rotoscope. Hello and welcome to 100 Years of Cinema. We'll be taking a look at one film a year from 1915 to track the evolution of film over the last century. Coco the Clown debuted in 1919 with a monthly cartoon series called Out of the Inkwell. Each cartoon typically starts with Max Fleischer playing himself, drawing Coco on an easel, and through the magic of animation, Coco comes to life. The cartoon amazed audiences with its smooth and lifelike animation. Coco starred in over 100 Out of the Inkwell cartoons throughout the 20s, and he would later reappear in tour cartoons alongside Betty Boop. Coco the Clown's perhaps not one of the most well-known cartoon characters, so how did this clown come to change the course of animation? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the cartoons that came before. The earliest example of projected animation that we know of is Humorous Phases of Funny Faces from 1906. Lines were drawn on a chalkboard, photographed, redrawn, and then rephotographed until they gave the illusion of motion. Animation kept this basic technique, slowly becoming more advanced, more fluid, and also adding new elements like colour. But no matter how advanced it was, animation drawn from hand always struggled to capture convincing movements and emotion. In 1914, Fleischer saw the cartoon that made him want to become an animator, Winsor McKay's Gertie the Dinosaur. He was fascinated with the process of animation, but he had an idea of how it could be done better. And in 1917, Fleischer patented the rotoscope, a device which would allow animators to sketch cartoons from live-action footage. He filmed his brother moving around in a clown costume, and then projected that film, frame by frame, on a sheet of frosted glass. Over the next year he traced around 2,500 drawings, and the result was Coco the Clown, the first rotoscoped cartoon. This new technique had some major advantages over animation drawn freehand. Because it was traced from a real person, for the first time animators were able to capture incredibly lifelike motion. Fleischer would use this to capture the dance routines of performers of the time like Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong with amazing accuracy. He would go on to use the technique on Betty Boop and Superman, as well as in the first rotoscoped feature-length film, Gulliver's Travels. Disney would use the technique to capture motion for their films, like Alice in Wonderland and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Rotoscoping allowed animators to capture lifelike expressions in faces, meaning characters could show convincing emotion for the first time. The vivid expressions made possible by the rotoscope helped move animation from a medium that was used to tell simple jokes to one that could tell a story with characters that could express complex emotions. Cartoons could suddenly have depth and drama. Rotoscoping would later be used to add effects to live action sequences, like the lightsabers from Star Wars, transitioning from the real world to a drawing in the video for Aha's Take Me On, or pulling someone into a digital world in Tron. Although it's now being done on computers, rotoscoping remains one of the most popular tools in animation. It's still being used for feature-length films like A Scanner Darkly and Sin City. Rotoscoping has produced some of the most iconic images in animation, and it all started almost 100 years ago with Coco the Clown. Thanks for watching. Let me know your favorite.
All right, so you get to see a complete history on animation and the importance of the rotoscope. And if you got to look at the early animation examples that the documentarian provided, they didn't really have the movement. They were more just kind of like frame by frame kind of drawings. And then you could see that when Max Fleischer developed his rotoscope, how the movement changed. And all of a sudden you had a cartoon character that moved fluidly, you know, like a human being. I think that was a major, major achievement. And it shows in his work.
Now, you remember a few weeks ago we talked about the flappers.
Right? And the flappers were the young ladies who really challenged society's expectations of who they were and what they could do as young women. And they existed in the 1920s. And we talked about they were basically young ladies who just wanted to live life to the fullest. And Max Fleischer was actually able to capture the same attitude in a character that he created, and her name was Betty Boop. Actually, a guy named Grim Natwick created Betty Boop, but Max Fleischer owned the rights to it. But so Betty Boop was really the personification of a real-life flapper. So you see the flappers there, they're really trying to live their life and express themselves in fashion and speech and everything like that. And so Betty Boop was that.
There were also two women who were the inspiration that helped
Max Fleischer create Betty Boop, with one being a direct influence and the other being an indirect influence. The first was Helen Kane, and there's Helen Kane right there. She was born in the Bronx on August the 4th, 1904. She was a vaudeville singer who became known for her rendition of a song called I Wanna Be Loved by You. All right, so right now we're gonna listen to this song, I Wanna Be Loved by You. And if you know Betty Boop, you've already heard this song because it was a song that was featured in her cartoons. But here we go, I Wanna Be Loved by You by Helen Kane. Here we go.
I'm not one of the greedy kind. All of my wants are simple. I know what's on my mind. I'm not resting until I find what would
so you got to hear that. Now,
You could also see
in Helen Kane's picture,
can you bring that up once again? You see in her eyes right there are very similar to how Betty Boop looks in the cartoon. So there's one other similarity right there. Now, another woman who was an indirect influence on Betty Boop was a singer by the name of Esther Jones. She was also known as Baby Esther. She was a regular performer at the Cotton Club, and Helen Kane and an agent went down and heard her sing, and Helen Kane was deeply influenced by her style of singing. She had the baby kind of singing, the baby sounding voice, and also she introduced an early version of a style of singing jazz where the vocalist creates words that are not really words. They're like letters that spell phrases, like when Helen Kane sang and she said oop oop be doo. That's like a scat thing. They call it scatting. So where you replace notes with a couple of letters. So like boo, boopy doo, ba boo ba doo ba doo ba da, or wop ba ba loo ba 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 bam boom. That's scatting. So Baby Esther had that element in her music, and Betty Boop, boop be doo be doo. It's like a scatting language. So that's all kind of similar, but they both were influential on the character that we know as Betty Boop. Now I'm going to let you hear Baby Esther do a little bit of her singing. It's a short clip, but you get to hear her singing and also some of her scatting. So let's check that out.
So crazy over you. It's the fun, 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 it's the
So you can see she's replacing words with do dee da do dee do da boo dee da boo dee do da. That's scatting,
Right? She's not saying, I walked down the street and then I saw him. She's not saying that. She says, da da ba doo wee, boo da ba doo woo. Right? So I hope you understand what I mean when I say scatting. So that's the element that Esther added to the music, and then that was influential on Betty Boop.
Now, Betty Boop was an important character because she expressed how women were feeling
At the time through the cartoons, or rather her creators did. And so there were feelings such as, women didn't necessarily want to be domesticated anymore. They didn't want to be just in the kitchen cooking and cleaning. And also there were issues that we now would call sexual harassment. Her character is dealing with all of that, all of those issues that women were concerned about. So she's also important in that way because she's saying, when you see some of her cartoons, as I will show you, that she's questioning how people are expecting her to clean and cook, or, questioning advances towards her. Like, no, dude, get away. And you see her face and, her eyes, and she's pushing the dude back. She doesn't want him on her. So that's another, or those are another or two more ways that she represented the flapper ideals. So that's important to note.
Now, jazz music was highly influential on the productions of Max Fleischer. He loved jazz, which you will see, and he gave a lot of exposure to jazz as well as used jazz to sell his cartoons. At the time, jazz was very, very, very big, so it wasn't really a question of him being able to sell jazz, but rather jazz was used to sell cartoons. Now, in particular, he liked two musicians. He liked Cab Calloway. There's Cab Calloway right there. Cab Calloway was born in Rochester, New York in 1907. He took over the Cotton Club after Duke Ellington left. So those were big shoes to fill after Duke Ellington left. And Cab Calloway was a very different performer from Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was more of the composer and arranger who wrote music for the dancers, who wrote music for the singers and the routines. Cab Calloway was more of a performer. He wrote music, but he was more like the guy who could sing, he could dance, who could be an MC. He was more of a showman. So that was the difference between him and Duke, but yet he still brought something that was different to that responsibility of being the house band at the Cotton Club. And he did it very well. One of his biggest hits was Minnie the Mooch, which I'm sure you've heard, and we're gonna listen to it, and you're gonna hear why you would know it. It's very, very catchy, very popular. Now, one thing I wanna point out about a lot of the performers during this time is that they used their face to express the songs that they were singing. And one thing I noticed is how Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Helen Kane, and also Betty Boop, they would all use their faces to really express how they felt in the song. This element, as I'm talking to you about it and explaining it, I know this comes from Broadway and musical theater, where people are far from you, and you have to be able to show expression for the person way in the back row. You want them to be able to know how you feel. So a lot of times, what you're seeing from them is animated, right? Animated facial expressions. So they'll smile really a lot, or they'll make their eyes open really a lot, you know what I mean? It's not an understated way of expressing oneself. And it transferred over to Betty Boop as well, because when you see her eyes are very big, and she's trying to express a lot of the same facial expressions that the performers were also expressing. I was going through the videos, and I noticed that. I said, wow, Helen Kane, Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, they all do this thing with their eyes and with their faces. That's different from now. Now people don't really do that. They don't express themselves. They might make maybe a simple face, but they don't express themselves in an exaggerated fashion like they did then. So that's something to note. Let's listen to Cab Calloway perform Minnie the Mooch. Minnie the Mooch. Here we go.
In 1958.
Story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down, hoochie-coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail. Minnie had a heart as big as a whale. Heidi, 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 ho! Heidi, 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 ho! Eddie, 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 Eddie! Eddie, 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 Eddie! Whoa! Heidi, 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 ho! Heidi, 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 ho! He gave her his townhouse and his racing horses. Each meal she ate was a dozen courses. Had $1 million for down and counted them all a million times. Howdy, 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 howdy. Howdy, 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 howdy. Howdy, 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 ho. Howdy, 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 ho. Scooty-boo, scooty-boo, scooty-boo. I said, poor man, poor man, poor. You win.
That was a great performance by
Cab Calloway singing Minnie the Mooch. And you will see as we continue in this class, you'll see the influence
of Cab Calloway on Max Fleischer and how Max Fleischer really appreciated him as a performer, as a dancer, and as a singer, and he
fused him in to his rotoscope technology and also into his animated presentations with Betty Boop.
So I thought that was very interesting how jazz and animation kind of grew together out of the 20s and out of the teens, but especially out of the 20s. That's when the two kind of really took off in a big, big way.
And also, Cab Calloway had an amazing range as a vocalist. You know, he could sing very high and very low. And he was a great performer too, a great dancer. And notice, you know, the exaggerated facial features. You know, for people who come from musical theater, you know what I'm talking about, because their faces are not in musical theater. Their faces are not broadcasted on a large screen. So you might have like 400, 500, 600 people in a hall. So how are they going to see that you look sad? Or how are they going to see that you look happy? You have to exaggerate it, make your face, make your facial expressions larger than what they really are for the person way in the back to see how you're feeling, you know. All right, so the next person that we're going to talk about is Louis Armstrong. Now, we spoke about Louis Armstrong a couple of times in the past, and so you know about who he is. You know, he's born on August the 4th, 1901. In New Orleans, Louisiana. He learned how to play the cornet when he was sent away to a waif's home for black boys. It was there he received music lessons on the cornet and fell in love with music. And of course, he went on to become one of the most highly regarded American musicians in the world. We got to remember that Louis Armstrong toured the world, so there are people from all over the world that know his music because he was a touring musician and because jazz has such an international appeal with the whole world. And he was the person who really took the music out, you know, to different countries, to different kings, queens, presidents all over the world. So he is that dude, you know what I mean? In that way. And then we're going to look at him perform Mac the Knife, and you're going to see a lot of the similarities in the way Betty Boop looks and the way Louis Armstrong, when he performs, you know, his facial expressions. And when you see Betty Boop later, you're going to see some of those similarities. So let's watch Louis Armstrong as he performs Mac the Knife.
Old shark has pretty teeth, dear, and he shows them very white. Just a jackknife, as like he did, and he keeps it out of sight. The shark bites with his teeth, dear. Scarlet billows start to spin. Fancy gloves and those where's my heel, dear? So there's not a trace of rain on the sidewalk. Sunday morning lies a body oozing life. Someone sneaking around the corner. Is that someone like tonight? Yes, from a tugboat by the river. I see that bag drooping down, and the seaman's above the wave, dear. That's you, my key, back to town. Yeah, Louis Miller disappeared, dear, after drawing out all his cash. And my key spent like a sailor till our boy do something rash. Suki Tadri, Jenny Diver, Gladys Lanier, sweet Lucy Brown. Oh, the line falls on the rise here. That's Maggie's back in town.
Armstrong.
And, you know, I want to just mention one thing. You know, a lot of the performers, I mean, we look back at these performances and we see these different people perform. And there are a lot of performers now that look back, and people also who analyze media and everything. And a lot of these performers were expected to smile all the time, especially if they were black. You know, nothing could ever be wrong in their lives, and they were expected to smile and when they performed. And so, you know, there's two ways to look at it. I mean, they were performers, and especially someone like Louis Armstrong prided himself on being not only a musician, but as, you know, a performer, someone who walks to the stage and gives a performance for the people. And in order to do that, you do have to smile. And he got a lot of flack for being someone who was always showing his teeth, or, you know. And there are people in media, in movies, you've seen it. If you watch older movies, you see some of the performers, especially the black performers, they smile a little too much, you know what I mean? The eyes are bugged. And so they have to fill these shoes that racism is expecting them to fill as a performer. So then you get someone who's smiling more than they would normally smile. Their eyes are wider than they would normally be. And, you know, they're almost expected to do that because they're black. You have to remember this is during Jim Crow. This is during a time when, you know, people were just on top of black people's backs, you know, and really on them about where they were going in society towards freedom. But then I'm thinking it must have been really hard for a performer like Louis Armstrong, who was a great performer, and yet at the same time he had to walk that line of
racism in America during these times. But, you know, at what point could he just be a good performer and not be doing the things that people will call, you know, Uncle Tomming? You know, how could he be a great performer and not be Tomming, you know?
And so I just think about that. That must have been a really, really difficult road for someone like him to travel on. he's looked at as being one of the greatest performers from that time. But yet, if you smile too much,
Then now you're Tommy, but he's still one of the greatest.
and then you saw Cap Calloway, he did the same thing. He was smiling and really putting on a good performance. You know, the difference is he's a lighter skinned man.
So it's not looked at the same. And that's a little bit unfair, you know, that automatically Louis Armstrong has to lock into those rules, but then Cap Calloway doesn't have to, and neither does Helen Kane as well, because she did the same kind of thing. She was smiling and happy and everything like that. So now she doesn't have to adhere to that type of rule, you know, but that's race during these times. It was complicated. Wasn't as easy as turning on and off a light switch, that you had different rules for different people in society, but yet the rules that stuck to Louis Armstrong were, in terms of people, how they critiqued it, it was a little more harsh. He was more harshly judged. But I can see that all the performers were smiling. All of them were exaggerated, and even Betty Boop was too. Just an observation to check out, because it does exist. There were performers after Louis Armstrong that would criticize him for smiling and everything because they felt like he was Uncle Tommy, but yet I never heard them say the same thing about other performers who are not dark skinned like Louis Armstrong. So just something I'm pointing out because you know I'm supposed to point that out, but something you can just kind of note off to the side, that the racial rules were very harsh when it came to black people in general, but also to a darker skinned person like Louis Armstrong. But yet at the same time, he was one of the greatest performers that America has ever produced. And you got to remember that he was living in a boys' home, a waif's home, a boys' home, you know, for supposedly bad kids. And he grew out of that to what you just saw. And you don't know, because if you don't know music, if you don't know jazz and know the music industry, you don't know about the numbers that he sold in terms of vinyl and the concerts he gave around the world. I mean, he was really one of those performers that the world wanted to see. So just something to check out. Okay, so now we're going to move on to looking at the rotoscope technology in motion while we watch Betty Boop's The Old Man of the Mountain. And here we're going to see jazz music being used to make Betty Boop hip. You have to remember that jazz was big at the time. Betty Boop was just coming out, but they used jazz music to really make her like the new thing. And remember that this is an adult cartoon, right? She was really the first cartoon that was where a woman was regarded and or a female animated character was regarded in an adult way, in a very sexy way for a female adult character. So when you see her, you see that, you see the maturity. It's not a kid's cartoon. And this performance is going to feature Cab Calloway and his orchestra. And also this performance or this movie was released into theaters around the world. So, you know, people will go and, you know, the Fox Theater or whatever, you know, theater that people will go to. Usually it's the Fox or the MGM Grand. They had different theaters that were owned by the different production companies. So Fox Productions had their own theaters. And there's still some Fox theaters around the country. There's one in Detroit. I've played them when I've been on tour with different people, but one in Detroit. There is one in Oakland, but they are usually very, very well-built, very beautiful theaters with balconies, and the woodwork and everything is just done in a very, very nice way. And some of them have been kept up, and they're great theaters when you walk into them. But anyways, this film was shown at all the theaters, and
I'm sure there was like a theater in every city around the country because Fox wanted to make sure that or in this case Paramount wanted to make sure that their movies were shown. So they'd own their own theater and then they'd show their own movies. So this is one of those movies, or rather animations, cartoon animations, and it's called Old Man of the Mountain. You're gonna get a kick out of this one. It's gonna be funny, watch.
Mountain. Whitebeard and a crooked stare tramps along with the folks all scared. With a diggle in his eye, he passes him by, the old man of the mountain. For he wears long hair and his feet are bare. They say he's mad as a grizzly. His cares are none and he fears no one. The old man of the mountain, he talks with the bears when he's lonely, sleeps with the sky for a tent, and he'll eat you up when he's hungry, and it wouldn't cost him a red cent. And he'll live as long as an old oak tree. He'll eat up fools like you and me. Oh, I often sigh and jump and cry at the old man of the mountain.
I'm going up to see that old man of the mountain. What's the matter?
The old man of the mountain. Mountain. You got to hold-dee-ho.
You gotta hold-dee-ho.
You got to hide-dee-hide.
You gotta hide-dee-hide.
You got got to heat the heat to get along with me.
Yeah, man, how
You got to learn my song.
I got to learn your song.
If you do me wrong,
I'm gonna do you wrong.
you got to kick the gong to get along with me.
What you gonna do now?
Gonna do the best I can. You got to hide the high.
You got to hide your high.
You got to heat the heat the heat.
You got to heat the heat the heat.
You got to head the head the head to get along with hey.
Hi.
Hey.
Ow.
Oh. When your sweetie tells you everything will be okay, just keep it with the bum and the good do skilly big keep it with the bum and the big body. If you feel like shouting, advertise it just this way. Skilly big skilly let's keep it with the hurry up skilly bitty well. Skilly big keep it with the bum and the skilly bitty hop, skilly bitty hop, skilly bitty lay. Oh, skilly bitty well.
It's pretty funny when you really check it out. Also, it's kind of funny to hear or to see a character like the old man with Cab Calloway's voice, because Cab Calloway is like a real singer. So to see a character that looks nothing like a singer, but then to hear them when they speak or sing, it's like a professional singer. It's quite comical. So that's, for me, I got a personal kick out of that. But it seems like that old man on the mountain, he definitely had people who wanted to take him down because everybody ganged up on him and tickled his feet, tied his arms up in knots. Bad situation. Don't be like the old man on the mountain. All right, so we're going to continue on with an example of Cab Calloway's, the singer again. His talent as a dancer and singer is going to be fused with Betty Boop's character.
So you're going to see a fusion go down now where you've seen him and his band perform, and then you've seen Betty Boop over here, and they've kind of been separate at times. And now you're going to see them all come together. You're going to see the movement, the singing, all that in this next clip. So let's check this out.
Why don't you eat? Fine!
send you out from the hazard. That's all. You hear? I won't have it. I won't have it. You go to school in the morning and you stay there all day with my class and you study hard. And you come home and you don't get the
Oh, come on, Daddy.
And I say, what is this? What is this? I won't have it. I won't have it. Why did you say something? Why did you say something? And why your father is not? What's this? What's it loose? What's this? Don't bother me. Don't bother me. Don't bother. I won't have it. I won't have it.
They always pick on me. They never let me be. I'm so very lonely, awfully sad. It's a long time since you've been glad. But I know what I'll do. By and by, I'll eat some worms and then I'll die. And when I'm gone, you wait and see. They'll all be sorry that they picked on me. Now what? Hello, Bimbo. I'm leaving home.
Yeah, I'll go with you. Meet me under your window.
Okay. Let's I'm not afraid. Are you, Bimbo? No.
Folks, now here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a red-hot hoochie coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail. Minnie had a heart as big as the whale. Hoddy, hoddy, ho. Hoddy, hoddy, ho. Hoddy, hoddy, hoddy. Hoddy, hoddy, hoddy. He-dee, he-dee, he. He-dee, he-dee. Hoddy, hoddy, ho. Hoddy, hoddy, ho. She messed around with a bluff named Smokey. She loved him though he was cokey. He took her down to Chinatown. He showed her how to kick the gong around. Showed her how to kick the gong around. daddy-o. La-la-la-la-la-o. Hi-dee-hi-dee-ho. Hi-dee-hi-dee-ho. He gave his townhouse and his racing horses. Yeah. Each meal she ate was a dozen courses. She had $1 million worth of nickels and dimes. She sat around and counted them all 1,000,000 times. Dee-ho, dee-ho, oh, dee-ho, 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 dee-ho.
Pretty funny. So you have a few different struggles. Oh, before I mention that, I talked about the fusion of Cab Calloway with the Betty Boop animation. So what's happening here is that you saw the walrus that was dancing around. So that was Cab Calloway, and that was the example of the rotoscope's technology. Capturing the movements of Cab Calloway. He's kind of dancing and doing his thing, right? But it's a walrus. So they took his movements, drew over it. They drew a walrus over it. And then you see a walrus that can dance like Cab Calloway. So that was the change. It was no longer Cab Calloway, kind of like as the performer, jazz musician. Now he's intertwined into the actual characters of the animated cartoon. So that made it different. Also, you have Betty Boop's character, and she was getting tired of her parents. She didn't want to be around her parents anymore. And she says, I'm leaving with my boyfriend. We're leaving, we're out of here. And then they end up going to the cave where all the goblins and ghosts are. And then she, which is you kind of expect because she's a flapper, she's kind of pushing back against what people expect of her socially, being a young woman. You stay home, and you saw her father in the beginning and her mom, they're right on her, telling her what she needs to do this, do this, do this. And then she leaves, I'm out of here, I want to be on my own with my boyfriend. Then she runs into the goblins and the ghosts, and runs back home, rips up the Dear John letter to her parents, and it says home sweet home after she rips it up. So it kind of goes against some of the issues that the flappers were making important, which was, fighting the expectations of what people wanted from them as young women. She was going in that direction, and then she went against it and said, I'm going back home. These goblins and ghosts are just a little too much. And so that's something you want to check out as well. Now we're going to wrap up Betty Boop, and we're going to move on to Josephine Baker. Now, during the time that the Harlem Hellfighters were in France during World War II, I don't know if you remember, but the Harlem Hellfighters were the 369th Regiment of World War II that freed the French from the Nazis. And shortly thereafter, Josephine Baker went to France. And during the 1920s, there were no African American women who were performers in France. And she was the first person, Josephine Baker. She ended up taking Europe by storm. Now, she was born Frida Josephine McDonald on June 3rd, 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri. She spent her youth in poverty. She had no money, came from real poverty. But then she learned how to dance, and she began traveling as a performer. And then at some point she said, you know what, this is not cutting it. I'm not making any money. And in the 1920s, she moved to France and then soon became one of Europe's most popular and highest paid performers.
And she went there as a dancer. She had different routines. First, she arrived with a group of people or a troupe, and they had performances that they gave in France, and they knocked the socks off of everybody. As you can see, she's a very beautiful woman, and she was a great performer. France had never seen anything like that. I mean, she really had a performance that just really knocked the socks off people, and the troupe as well. And then shortly thereafter, she went on her own, and she became her own, act, and continued to perform throughout Europe. And she also became an activist, fighting for equal rights. She ended up adopting a lot of children from different racial backgrounds. That's how much she did not like the racial limitations that were available to her in America. And so she adopted children from all over the world, and wanted to really put her activism where her mouth was or where her money was, and invested in these children and raised them. And
one of the things you want to know about her, she really was a trailblazer, both as a humanitarian, as an activist, and as a performer. I mean, she was like basically where, like when we think about like a performer, like a Lady Gaga or anyone like that, she was that. Janet Jackson, Madonna, like a real high-level performer, she was that. She a dancer, a singer, but more of a dancer and a performer more than a singer. And she was highly successful. She was, like I said, one of the top performers in Europe, not just France, in Europe. She made a lot of money and was highly regarded by the French and by the Europeans. She was the first performer to go to Europe to really do that on that level as a black person, as an African American. So she's very important. We're gonna watch some footage of her doing the Charleston. There are other videos of her performing, but I couldn't show them because some of them are really, they're very provocative. But we're gonna watch her as she does the Charleston. And you remember the Charleston was a dance created here in America. She brought the Charleston over to Europe. And so they had never seen anything like that. So it really had created a phenomenon. She had created a phenomenon that she was an American black performer going to Europe, showing them dances and approaches to expressions that they just hadn't seen before. And plus she was very beautiful, so she used to captivate the men, and they just, stood still when the great Josephine Baker performed. So we're gonna watch Josephine in one of her more PG performances as she dances the Charleston. Here we go, Josephine Baker. You know, it's a trip. There was that one facial expression she was using, and she made her eyes go up, and then she'd look away and then start dancing. They showed that like 5 times.
Which I thought was interesting, so they kept repeating that.
Yeah, so that was Josephine Baker. Wow, she's very beautiful, as you can see, very elegant lady.
Right there in the photo.
And that pretty much wraps up session 13.
And we will see you online. And for the students, I'll definitely see you online. For the other folks, we'll see you on session 14, all right? Thanks a lot and have a good day.
All right, bye-bye.